We're so honored to be joining all of you, and it's great to see all the introductions coming in through the chat. So today, of course, we're very honored to be presenting on behalf of the Power Lab. My name's Mercedes Sharpe Zayas, and I am the Workforce Planning Coordinator with the Parkdale People's Economy, as well as the co-facilitator with the Power Lab. I'm joined here also with Alejandra Bravo, who is the director of the lab, and we're going to be hearing from her shortly. Just to give you a sense of what this webinar is going to comprise of today, we're going to be starting off, of course, with our introductions, and then giving a bit of an overview of the Power Lab, some of the case studies that are going to actually be introduced by our Power Lab partners. So we're also going to be joined on the line by Kumsa Bakker from the Toronto Community Benefits Network, as well as Judy Duncan coming from Acorn Canada. And we're going to hear from each of them about how they've been grounding their practices and engaging in local fair economies on the ground. We're also going to be speaking a little bit today about some of the key insights that we've been gathering through the practice of building out this lab. And some of the reflections then we're hoping to hear are from all of you on the line, and we welcome you either to actually write out your questions as they come throughout the group chat, and or to ask them verbally when we get to that period. So just a little bit of a background on what exactly is the Power Lab. The Power Lab is an experiment in shared learning through practice with organizers on the ground. It is a space that brings together people who are building economic and democratic power in equity-seeking communities to shift the material conditions of historically disadvantaged groups. Core to our work is building strong analyses of power as a relational force that we can harness through collective action and that can be transformed through local organizing for fair economies. Our partners are building a new landscape for economic justice in the Canadian context, one that intersects with racial justice, disability justice, climate justice, through a set of shared values grounded in equity, humility, and inclusivity. We've been able to collectively develop a number of different guiding principles that in many ways inform our work. One of those is the idea of generating power by building economic and democratic power within historically disadvantaged and equity-seeking communities. Another core principle that we engage in is community agency, the idea of centering the voices of those most impacted at the decision-making table. We engage in a diversity of tactics, drawing on different approaches in order to influence the legislative, policy, and project agendas in which we're addressing. Another core guiding principle that we have is this idea of equitable development, that we can transition from traditional development through a values-based framework. And finally, one of our core guiding principles is the idea that we have accountability to people, that our organizing is transparent and accountable to a constituency or a base of people. So with that said, I'm going to pass this on to Alejandra Bravo to begin to talk about some of the histories that have grounded our work.
Hi, everyone. We're excited to be here with you. And I think it's, you can tell that this is a values-first practice that we're talking about. So we thought that we would share what we think our sort of movement ancestors are, and you may see yourselves located there as well. The Power Lab comes out of this idea that we need to build community and worker economic power to transform that conditions that the people that we're serving are actually living in. And so we think about ourselves as located within this practice that's been within Canada's DNA for a long time. We're learning a lot from the way Indigenous people talk about the economy as the place and the way to fulfill the obligations that we have to each other. And, we think about the Antigonish movement and others in Canada that's been cooperativist and built on collaboration to lift each other out of poverty through a relational practice that ended up building an amazing amount of social and economic power for people who had been historically marginalized. And we think that that's relevant today. Let's go to the next slide. In a contemporary way, the community benefits work that we're doing, which is a bit of the focus right now. That's not the only strategy that the Power Lab partners are experimenting with. But it finds its roots in movements like Los Angeles. If you think about Los Angeles in the 90s, people immediately think about the Rodney King acquittal, the riots, the social and economic and racial divides that characterized that city. And it was through the organizing of labor leaders, working with community leaders who had been really struggling with the changes of deindustrialization and the growth of the service economy that characterizes so many of the places where we live, or in some places it's energy transformations or resource transformations. They started to work on building small to big wins for and by people. It's so the living wage campaign started. It grew into the community benefits movement, which won historic benefits for people. For example, scholarships, affordable housing, guarantees of work for target groups. And that's an idea that we've resonated with, because along the way they've built political power, and it's used a lot of movement building frames that are relevant to our work today. So we like to think that this work is very much aligned or living inside of the community economic development movement. This is the tradition to which we belong. And, I think we think of community economic development practitioners and organizations as being so resource rich. You have technical expertise and staff and volunteers, and there's the spaces for convening and the kind of trusted convener that the organizations can play, and the programs that are offered that could be aligned and adapted to really help to support organizing aims that come from communities that have been disadvantaged themselves. So just wanted to share a little bit about how we view the social practice. It's familiar for people that have done a popular education, but also union education. It's just starting with meeting people who have been historically disadvantaged where they are. We're talking about power being relational, that it can be built. And these are facilitative questions that we're exploring so that people together can theorize and analyze their experiences, make meaning of the action that allows the development of a practice that kind of pulls out new strategies and new tactics that people can employ to see a material difference in their lives, apply in the real world. And we think that this generates a new way of knowing and a new way of doing in a way that we can behave with each other in a way that's relational and that leaves a lot more behind. Over to Mercedes.
Hi, everyone again. So now I'm going to start to share some of the information about our actual work on the ground. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, I'm part of a project called the Parkdale People's Economy. We're a network of over 30 different community-based organizations in Parkdale, as well as hundreds of residents that are working towards decent work, shared wealth, and equitable development in Parkdale. For those of you who aren't familiar with Parkdale, it's a neighborhood located within Toronto. That's a traditionally working class neighborhood. About a third of the community members are newcomers. A number of community members are psychiatric survivors. And it's a neighborhood that's very much so being impacted by increasing pressures of gentrification. And so in order to be able to address this pressure on the neighborhood, we actually started a community economic development planning project in the neighborhood as a way of being able to sort of address some of the underlying factors in terms of inequality of wealth taking place in the neighborhood. So our planning process that we engaged in, it was participatory, but it was also very much so guided through the lens of community economic development. And we did this for two different reasons. The first was the urgent need to address growing inequality and poverty with respect to the growth of precarious work, the housing crisis, and food insecurity within Parkdale as well as within the broader city of Toronto. We also decided to take on a community economic development lens in order to explore some more of the community-based economic interventions that promote equitable health outcomes by improving social determinants of health. So one of the core focuses, of course, that we tend to focus on in the neighborhood is especially around housing as a really significant core need in terms of addressing people's economic well-being. We were able to adapt a systems change approach to community economic development that was built on the principles of shared ownership, of democratic governments, as well as an ethics of care, to understand the systems and conditions in which wealth is actually created within Parkdale and has the potential to actually be redistributed. We saw this as critical for addressing growing pressures of gentrification in the neighborhood, and central to bringing our plan to life was very much so the practice of organizing. We saw the need to build collective power from the ground up in order to be able to shift the material conditions of working class community members in Parkdale. We're lucky to be working in a neighborhood that already has a very strong culture of and history of resistance. And so this is very much so something that we were able to tap into with this work, as well as to be able to harness with the added capacity of a community benefits organizer. So we're lucky also to have Ana Teresa Portillo on the line as well to be able to support that kind of work. So one of the ways that we've been really engaging in organizing in the most recent years has specifically been with regards to the growing pressures of development taking place in Parkdale. We've been seeing pressures coming from different surrounding neighborhoods that are especially experiencing a lot of increased condo development, all taking place in a way that in many ways excludes and is built on the practice of displacement of community members as something that's very much so pricing out the availability of the housing stock in Parkdale. And so, of course, we were able to actually build a proactive and comprehensive framework that was built on the principles of participatory democracy within our planning process to be able to create a framework that once again draws on the tradition that Alejandra was able to state at the beginning in terms of the amazing grassroots movements that happened within the states that ultimately started the community benefits movement. And we very much so took on from that tradition in terms of being able to engage in a participatory process that centered and valued the needs of community first. So the idea being that we would no longer stand for development that only stands for profit rather than the needs of the local community. And so our community benefits framework is something that we were able to develop through many workshops, through many different meetings, and over the course of about 18 months it took to develop, that ultimately set out the needs for an equitable process when it comes to development taking place in neighborhoods, in order to understand the needs of affordable housing and what affordability actually means on a community level, the needs of affordable commercial, not only for local businesses, social enterprises, and co-ops, but also for the many social agencies that are currently placed within commercial leases that have absolutely no form of rent control. We were able to create different demands around decent work, and we're about to hear also from different movements that are taking place that have a very strong labor tradition in terms of how we actually demand for community benefits in terms of local work opportunities when infrastructure development takes place. And then finally, we were able to make calls for community assets, such as being able to create the opportunity for new community spaces that are not privatized and that allow for community to come together and to be able to engage in the process of understanding how the neighborhood is changing and influencing the actual vision for how the neighborhood is changing. So we've been able to actually bring this to life in many ways through the collective organizing of community members calling for community benefits. For example, if you look to the slide, we actually have one from our recent National Housing Day, which is when a number of community members took over 11 Brock Avenue, which is a publicly owned asset, to call for 100% social housing on that site. And so we see this as an opportunity that we're continuing to bring alive through the practice of organizing. And with that, I'm going to now move on to Kumsa Bakker from the Toronto Community Benefits Network, who's another one of our Power Lab partners who will be sharing his experience through Rexdale Rising. So Kumsa, if you are on the line.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah,
I'm on the line.
You.
I had trouble with the mute button, but it's a pleasure to be on this, to be part of this discussion today. My name is Kumsa Bakker. I'm with the Toronto Community Benefits Network. Our organization is fairly new. We turned 5 years old in March, and we're a network of over 107 organizations now, and it includes so we're a coalition of community organizations, grassroots groups, social enterprises, labor unions, construction trade training centers, and workforce development agencies. And the Toronto Community Benefits Network has centered itself at the forefront of economic justice movement in Canada by negotiating community benefit agreements into public infrastructure and urban development projects. And in doing so, the TCBN is addressing the challenges of access to good jobs, local economic development, and skill shortages by connecting people from historically disadvantaged communities and equity-seeking groups in Toronto. And our main focus is with women, newcomers, Indigenous, and racialized individuals as well as youth and veterans, and support them into the economic opportunities that we negotiate through community benefit agreements. The TCBN employs a comprehensive approach that includes grassroots organizing, innovative policy, research, and communications. And we work in direct collaboration with government, in many different neighborhoods across the city of Toronto, as well as labor, industry, and other key stakeholders. Some of the efforts to date include in 2015 securing the community benefits framework with Metrolinx. So Metrolinx is the arm's length agency of the provincial government that's bringing on new transit projects in Ontario. And the first project that was brought forth was the Eglinton Crosstown Lrt, which is a project that's pretty much cutting across the heart of the city. And going through many different what the city calls neighborhood improvement areas. So these are areas of the city which historically have higher concentration of poverty. And with this initially $6 billion investment and now $9 billion investment coming into our city, communities start to organize and say, is there a way where we can connect the people that need opportunities, whether it be in the trades, whether it be through professional, administrative, and technical positions that are related to the construction industry, to actually get a job or an opportunity to work and at this new project. So from there, we were able to secure what we call a community benefits framework with Metrolinx. And what this allowed us to do was work with the consortium that was selected to build a project, Crosslinx Transit Solutions. And we worked on developing 3 different sort of what we call community benefit plans. And the first one being a community benefits apprenticeship plan, which specifically highlighted the commitments around 10% of all the apprenticeship opportunities at that project would go to the target groups that we support at the TCBN, as well as a community benefits liaison plan, which sort of highlighted some of the work that Crosslinx Transit Solutions was going to do to support the local community, so supporting small and medium enterprises as well as social enterprises through procurement, and as well as a declaration on hiring targets. And to date, we've actually seen some success from on the Eglinton Crosstown Lrt. Our latest report from Crosslinx Transit Solutions has 105 placements in the apprenticeship pathway from our targeted groups, as well as 150 placements into what we call the professional, administrative, and technical positions. And usually these are positions that are related to the construction industry. So that can be architects, engineers, office staff, administrative staff, etc. So from that, we were able to secure also similar commitments on the Finch West LRT project, which is a new transit project that's starting this year, as well as working with the Ontario government to identify 5 different pilot projects across Ontario, which will also include community benefits. And that also in Toronto, that includes 2 additional projects, which is the West Park Healthcare Center, as well as the Woodbine Casino, as well as, the McDonald Block expansion. For the last few minutes that I do have today, I did want to speak to one of the private community benefit, or one of the community benefit agreements we were able to secure with a private developer in the city of Toronto. And that was through the Rexdale Rising campaign in Rexdale. So for people, if people don't know much about Toronto, Rexdale is a community that's located near the airport, sort of an area historically where there's been a high concentration of poverty. We've also seen in Rexdale a lack of investment in social services, as well as transit. So being able to travel to access work is a large difficulty that many people have in Rexdale. And in 2008, the provincial government announced that they were going to be allowing for an expansion of the current Woodbine slots and racetrack to expand it into a full entertainment complex, which would include a casino expansion, as well as hotels, as well as retail and other restaurant spaces. And this $1 billion investment was going to come to the local community in Rexdale. And a lot of people started to have conversations around what are some of the benefits that can come to the local community, which had identified a huge need for not only jobs, but also supporting some of the small and medium enterprises that are in the surrounding community. From that, a community labor coalition called Community Organizing for Responsible Development, which was a community and labor coalition that was started with some resident leaders, as well as some of the unions that represented the workers at the current Woodbine racetrack and slots. And from that, they were able to organize in the community, and we were very supportive in building out not only a vision for this one specific project, but a vision for the future of Rexdale. And really seeing that in the city of Toronto at a time where there's lots of investment in infrastructure, that the community of Rexdale inevitably will have the eye of developers and the development industry. But is there a way where we can set expectations around these developments? And from that, we were able to organize, build a strong committee, what we call the Rexdale Rising Committee. And this included some resident leaders, as well as some neighborhood organizations, as well as key policy leaders in the city, to come together and work around and build a vision, and that included economic vision, which called for good jobs, living wages, and worker rights. An economic vision also included the demand for training and apprenticeships. People also wanted to see local hiring targets, so actually targets that committed to hiring locally, as well as equity hiring. So understanding that in the city of Toronto, not everybody's benefiting economically. So being able to specifically include targets around equity hiring was another big focus for building out that economic vision. The vision also included a social vision. So ensuring that there was affordable, high quality childcare for the residents of Rexdale, as well as health services, recreational and social amenities. And we were also able to build out a green vision, which included neighborhood and environmental improvements, and also environmental protections. So understanding that when development does come, is there a way where we can, is there a way that we can mitigate the risk of harm to the community? And is there a way where we can actually use that development to actually provide neighborhood improvements, whether it be through parks or green spaces, or whether it be through other type of amenities. So I just wanted to highlight some of the wins that we were able to get from that work. It was actually a long period of organizing to secure this community benefits agreement. It's actually the first agreement that was actually signed with the city of Toronto. And some of the work that we did was, once we were able to build out the vision, being able to go door to door, talk to some of the neighbors, get people committed and sign on to a petition, asking that our local representatives, so the local councillor as well as the mayor, to support these demands for community benefits agreement. We were also able to actually formally present a community benefit agreement to the developer, which was One Toronto Gaming. And after receiving our proposal for community benefits, they actually declined wanting to commit to an agreement with the community. However, we did know that the city of Toronto did have some leverage through the zoning to allow for this expansion. So working with the city of Toronto around setting conditions. So we actually, city of Toronto, we were actually able to work with the city of Toronto on setting conditions to the expansion of this facility. And the city of Toronto was able to incorporate these demands into their zoning requirements. And from there, we were able to secure 10% apprenticeships for our target groups, as well as for all the long-term operational positions, 20% local hiring, as well as an additional 20% what we call social hiring. for social procurement, we were able to get a 10% commitment for the procurement opportunities going to small, medium sized and social enterprises, and as well as $5 million commitment for a childcare center to be built in Rexdale, as well as a community seat at the table. So while we're organizing and pushing the city to enter into community benefits agreement, the City of Toronto really wanted to control the process. So meeting with community, but also meeting with the developer, but not wanting community to actually be at the table. And then I would say in terms of our organizing, that was one of the biggest fights that we had, was ensuring that community had a seat at the table, not only in negotiating the community benefits agreement, but also monitoring and evaluating the agreement. So one of the things that coming out of the signing this agreement is the commitment that every quarter there's what we call an oversight committee. And this oversight committee will review some of the results of the community benefit agreement on a quarterly basis, and that committee includes two resident representatives, as well as the developer, as well as the City of Toronto, as well as the Toronto Community Benefits Network, and the Atkinson Foundation, as well as United Way. So bringing together key stakeholders, including community, to be at the table, that are constantly working together to achieve the goals of the community benefit agreement, because it's not up to one party, sort of our experience working on community benefit agreements, that it's not up to one party or community group or organization or developer to do all this work. The success of community benefits and the community benefit agreements is when all stakeholders with community are working together to achieve the goals that have been set out. So thank you for just hearing a little bit of the work that that's happening in Toronto around community benefits, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kumsa. We're now going to move over to Judy Duncan from Acorn Canada. Judy, if you're on the line, please join now.
Yeah, I'm here. There's a bit of an echo. Okay, I'll just power through it. So yes, thanks. I work with Acorn Canada, which is a not-for-profit membership-based organization that works in low and moderate income communities. So we have a very kind of specific organizing structure that we do. We spend a lot of our resources going door to door, talking to people about what their biggest issues are. And then we get people together in groups and help them plan out campaigns that they've identified in their neighborhood. We do what we call community organizing drives, which is a series of meetings where we get people together and brainstorm the issues that they want to work on, and then start researching who the targets are, what our demands are, and then through that process, we set up what we call local chapters. And so the members of a local chapter would elect like a chair and a co-chair and a secretary of that local group. So just for example, so then that would feed into our in Toronto, our citywide board there, which would be made up of like the 5 chapters in Toronto. So there'd be 5 chairs. So when we're working in neighborhoods, a big piece of what we're doing is doing a lot of leadership development with just average people on the ground, helping them, speak to the press, speak to targets. We do a lot of like direct actions. We do a lot of door-to-door work with staff, but we also do a lot of capacity and training with our membership around doing like petitioning and like door-to-door work in apartment buildings and stuff like that. So we have a big distinction in our organization between staff and the leadership. So like the leaders are the people who are elected to our local boards, and they drive the direction of our campaigns, and that feeds right up to our national level. So at the national board, it's made up of 2 reps from the local chapters that sit on the national board and then drive the direction of our national campaigns. So we do, to give a few examples of the work that we do around campaigns. So housing is a big issue. We do a lot of work around like fighting to improve building standards, and we have like landlord licensing campaigns in many of the cities that we work in. And then we also have a lot of local, provincial, and federal campaigns around affordable housing. And that actually kind of starts touching into like community benefit work as well. So in one way to look at it, one of our campaigns around inclusionary zoning is, fighting for like citywide bylaws that mandate that all, private developers that are coming into a city have to include 30% affordable housing in their buildings. So this is a big campaign that we've been focusing on a lot in Ontario, and specifically we had a big victory last year when we finally got the province to give the city the power to create their own bylaw. And so now we're in the midst of campaigns in Toronto, Ottawa, and Hamilton around trying to get the municipalities to move forward with these bylaws that include a decent amount of affordable housing. So we're saying 30% affordable housing, and we want 40% in high transit zones. In Toronto and in Ottawa and Hamilton, it's a little bit different in each of those cities, but it's one of a key campaign that we're working on. We also do a campaign, we're a multi-issue organization. So we do a lot of work on other campaigns like around fair banking. And this started from our membership because so many people were using like Money Martin and like the predatory lenders that are growing in nature in low and moderate income neighborhoods. So we started by fighting to regulate Money Mart and those places at the provincial level. And we won legislation in a number of provinces around regulating that, but the interest rate that they came in with was pretty weak. So more recently, we've switched that to a federal campaign where we're really trying to force the banks to serve our communities. And there's a number of demands there, where including like lowering NSF fees, because so many people pay like $48 if they like bounce a $15 check, but also getting them to set up like an alternative small dollar loan at a low interest rate for low and moderate income people when they have an emergency, so that they don't have to go to payday lenders. Other national campaigns that we have is we have a big Internet for All campaign, which we're fighting for affordable internet for low and moderate income people. So targeting both the telecom and the federal government to create these programs. And we had a really big victory last year where we got the federal government to implement a program that included all low-income parents can access a $10 a month program if they receive the maximum amount of the national child care benefit. So there's good and bads. I mean, it equaled about $80 million across the country, but it's not as inclusive as we'd like. So we're keeping the pressure on that campaign as well. And federally with housing, we do a lot of work around, we're trying to improve the national housing strategy and the right to housing, and we're trying to actually move forward with a campaign around forcing these big corporate landlords to not only make decisions around financial gain, that they have to look in a longer term view, and they have to include things such as like social housing when they are like setting the rents, because there's such a growing problem with these big landlords going in and targeting substandard buildings and renovating them, and then dem-evicting all the tenants and then doubling the rent. And this is just like a growing problem in Canada. And in Ottawa, we're in the middle of a big fight against Timber Creek there, because they're doing it to this neighborhood. And so our leadership and our membership there have been really fighting to get them to do like a community benefits agreement with the leaders in the building to have like 25% like a real affordable housing there, and that to make sure anyone who is evicted has like a unit that they can move into in the neighborhood right there at the same rent and the same size, plus a bunch of demands around like local hiring and stuff. And lastly, I'll just talk about, every 2 years we do a national convention, and it's this June, so June 15th to 17th in Hamilton. So 300 of our members are going to come to Hamilton from across the country, and it's open to people who aren't our members. So if anybody wants to join, they're more than welcome, and they can reach out to me.
Thank you, Judy, for that. And thanks to everybody for the great comments and questions in the chat. I feel like we're having a terrific conversation, and sharing that chat might be a really good, thing to do later. So what we're really showing you here is sort of how to get started on this work. It doesn't have to be a community benefits campaign. It could lend itself to other sort of strategies, but really starts with a commitment to shared values, which means doing the important facilitated sloggy work of actually getting people aligned. And some of the cases that you've heard about that requires multiple meetings and people kind of agreeing on the important agenda that they're going to carry forward together, even while they may disagree on a bunch of other points or have divergent priorities. The relationship with labor is incredibly powerful. It's come up in the chat already, and it's the kind of the strength that a membership-based organization has with the kind of resources that the labor movement has, in addition to expertise around how like the workforce actually works, especially in the construction side. It's been super powerful. The fostering the idea of learning while doing. We are really not advocating for like giving you a handbook or capturing a model. We're inviting all of us to in relation develop new strategies by doing stuff in the real world and then sharing those insights. And we know that the world changes and shifts. So kind of kept like a model is a bit frozen in time, and we're saying that we want to actually disrupt the way that things are working. Question about mobilizing. Absolutely, direct action has been a feature of all of these campaigns. Phone calls to disrupt development. Making sure that showing up in places. And there's more answers that I've provided around that. But if you're just working a lobbying strategy, there's no way to demonstrate that you have power, and therefore it's very difficult to be heard. Connecting to the internal champions, and often within systems and even within our like a parallel partnership, we have a partner who works within a regional government. It's an organizer's mentality. It can be carried by anyone. It's not a positional thing. It's actually a commitment to changing the way that we function and who we're centering. If we actually care about historically disadvantaged people and equity-seeking groups, no matter where we sit, we can advance an organizing agenda. And finally on this, it's just like really focusing on targets, like measurable things, because people are tired of being invited to participate in processes that lead nowhere, and that there's just no more trust. Unless we can materially change people's lives, it's not going to work. So we want to raise ambitions for what's possible, leverage the assets that exist in community, engage new unlikely allies, and make sure that we are moving up to the win. This is at the powerlab.ca website, but it's what we think that how we can disrupt the local development processes with this practice. And it's sort of like people like to say, if you're not at the table, probably going to be on the menu. So to make sure that we have more opportunity for questions, going to move right ahead. And I'm just like, I think it's worth like saying something about coalition building. It's not easy. Like I mentioned, the thing about shared values, it's just constantly checking this and articulating them, and also talking about the principles in which people are going to operate with each other, the transparency and accountability. One way to ensure accountability is to make sure that that we're centering the people that we intend to be supporting, that they're sitting at the table, and not as a representative of a lived experience, but as a representative of a base of people. And that base organizations that have bases and memberships need to be very powerfully represented there. And that really important around coalition building is that this practice doesn't work unless we're challenging unequal power relations, and that means within our own movements. Just a couple of calls to action. I'm going to invite Kumsa to put into the chat links that you could follow to around Bill C-344. which is federal infrastructure legislation to ensure that community benefits are part of infrastructure investment. And if you want to join that action, it's there. And we're going to share the Acorn Canada website link so you could join, support one of their campaigns, and maybe I'll see you in Hamilton. I'll be there. So we want to get Mercedes over to the. I know we have a few minutes. We have about 10 minutes or a little longer for more reflections and questions. But really juicy stuff happening here in the chat. So inviting people now to respond to, or maybe our questions were too simplistic.
So yeah, absolutely. So we obviously tried to create a broad sense of questions just to get people started in conversation, but we already have a really amazing conversation happening within the chat. So we do welcome everyone to offer their comments there. Of course, our reflections are things we wanted to hear, are things about what did you learn through some of these case studies that we've shared? What does it mean to your work? And what are some of the common themes that have emerged for you? And then for us as well, looking ahead, of course, many of us most likely will be taking place in Economies in the new year. And so we also wanted to think a little bit about what you would like to explore with us in the future and what workshop topics about organizing would be useful. A couple of things we're already hearing within the chat are questions around what is the diversity of tactics that are being used within these movements? How are we actually embedding organizing into the work in terms of achieving a successful community benefits agreement? I think that was echoing a comment I saw from Bronwyn in the group chat. We also had questions about different policy tools that can be supporting this. So I noticed that Randall also was bringing in questions around zoning policies and how we can actually use that as a point of leverage. But one thing that I did want to reflect back on and offer people to think of is a question that was brought up by Teresa in the chat as well, right at the very beginning, about what would actually be required for other communities to be able to put forward similar frameworks and movements within their communities in order to set minimum standards for equitable development. And this is something that we welcome you either to put into the comment section in terms of questions and or to unmute yourself and offer any insights at this moment as well.
I think while we get people to speak, I just wanted to share that there's an event that Kumsa is talking about, and the strategy that mobilized like hundreds of people, 1,000 signatures for Woodbine. That was hatched. Judy Duncan was there with some Acorn members. It was in a small community center room. There were local residents and local labor activists, and there was only a chalkboard, so each time the capture of the strategy decisions were made, it had to be erased. We had to take pictures of it and erase it. So it was truly like a community-based strategy that it wasn't done by anybody in that sort of with any additional expertise there. Is anybody feeling like they're going to jump in here, or should we just continue to look at some of the questions, Mercedes?
Mm-hmm. Am I unmuted now? Okay. So there are a couple different quite pointed conversations that were started here that actually we could maybe call on our partners to discuss. One was actually Judy. There was a question asking just about what exactly inclusionary zoning is and how that's being achieved in different cities. So potentially if you could maybe offer a little bit of insight about inclusionary zoning to people on the call, that would be very helpful, and how that's actually being leveraged through a community benefits organizing campaign as well.
Not sure if Judy's. I think we'll have to skip that one. So one thing I could say to answer that question is that there's enabling legislation at the provincial level. The victory there was to make sure that that people were able, that local municipalities would be able to define their own inclusionary zoning rules instead of having one weak central piece of legislation. And that means that there's an organizing horizon for every community. Now, one of the things that Acorn and others are doing is to imagine what would be the foundational elements, like what's the minimum specs that we want in every community in Ontario, and to align those campaigns. So it's like it's only going to be done through like relationship building and power building. There's a question here around the scale is so big, and like how do you know which projects to pick, particularly since there's so many of them, and I think that maybe I'll let Kumsa answer how it is that like TCBN, for example, and others are picking the projects that they're going to participate, like what they're going to try to get a community benefits agreement for.
Awesome. In terms of our approach to which projects we're going to organize around, I think like the first thing that we look at is scale, as well as what are the levers that are going to allow us to enter into community benefit agreements. So initially, a lot of the focus at TCBN has been trying to leverage large-scale infrastructure projects that are public. So looking at the large-scale LRT investments that are coming into our communities, we're seeing large-scale hospitals being redeveloped, or new additions coming to different healthcare facilities in our community. Looking at some of the different buildings, so like the ministry buildings. So I know the Provincial, the Queen's Park Provincial buildings are undergoing a lot of remediation and reconstruction work. So that's another opportunity to really leverage the money that the government is spending itself to leverage community benefits. And we've done something very similar on a municipal level as well, working with the City of Toronto to look at some of its own capital projects that they complete every year. A great example would be a new Housing Now initiative, which the City of Toronto recently identified 11 city-owned sites that they were looking to use to develop some affordable housing on, and included in that. And I know the folks at Parkdale were very active in ensuring that when the city does end up either building it on their own or leasing it to a developer to build these projects, that for the ones that are large enough of scale, to also ensure that those projects include community benefits. So really trying to see like leverage our public infrastructure dollars to really stretch those to go further to support some of the target groups and underrepresented groups that we support. And typically we don't see community benefits being very valuable if it's a really small project. And what I mean by small, I would say between $1 to $50 million. Usually those are projects, because it does take some work to sort of coordinate the key stakeholders and building out a community benefit program. So if it's anything less than $50 million, usually we don't engage with.
Okay, I think
Judy,
is this
go ahead. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
you can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So inclusionary zoning, like in Ontario right now, a number of the cities the staff are starting to investigate what that could look like. So it's an important moment to get in there. Like in Toronto, for example, they are doing like a stakeholder meeting with the developers and on the community side. So it's a bit of a battle between what the developers are saying is feasible, because they're so broke and they couldn't possibly stand to like lose one penny or they're going to go out of business, sort of thing, is their angle. And, on the other side, we're trying to argue for like a strong inclusionary zoning bylaw. I know in Ottawa, and I think in Hamilton, and I think in London, the city staff are also moving forward. So if you live in any of those cities or in any city across Ontario, it would be a good time to reach out to the city to find out where they are, and then just start, running an aggressive campaign around like fighting for lots of affordable housing in all the new condos. In each other province, it's slightly different depending on what powers the province has. So I'm happy to talk offline more about this. But I think it's just, given the context, it's, a good opportunity to, fight to get some, when you look at the richest people in Canada, many of those are like real estate developers. And I think this is a good opportunity to try to win some affordable housing as all of these, especially if you live in a big city, as all these like developments and condos are going in.
There's a lot of sort of questions around like just the scale of the challenge and the opportunity with development. And it's, for example, like what working with inclusionary zoning across Canada, it's actually, the reality is that these trends tend to be North American in scale. So we're learning from other cities about what, just as the developers are larger and larger all the time. So one of the things that we're trying to do is to collect that knowledge and quickly and share it across members, and that's why this conversation has been so important. I can't say that there's currently sort of a repository for these things. It's mostly held within the organizers, and and it's a big task. So Acorn has chapters all over the country, but because the campaigns are generated from the ground, it's difficult to say, or like CCEDN is being requested as a technical advisor by a lot of different campaigns. So one thing I would say is, like, if there is a specific public process for a development that's about to be approved or is in the horizon, that's the time to start, to identify those, what it is that you want, who are your people, who are you working to lift up, who are you accountable to. That's the work that we can't delay. And then figuring out what the technical support for those people to get what they want is possible. And we've got some good examples of, for example, maybe you can just briefly say how a group of Toronto community housing, social housing tenants interrupted a process.
And I think one thing I would just quickly add to that, and especially, of course, there's the wider conversation happening around inclusionary zoning, and we look to cities that have some of the strongest legislations around that, at least in terms of high percentages. You look to places like New York, San Francisco, Chicago, and those are by no means affordable places to live, right? So oftentimes it's really important to recognize these as tools, but also tools that can be in many ways co-opted. And so that's one of the most important ways where once you're actually able to build a really strong localized knowledge and set of language around what we mean by affordability and what that scale actually looks like, that's one of the keys to actually being able to assert power. And that's something earlier that also Teresa mentioned in the chat. Once again, something that we find very important in Parkdale in terms of the work we do, and there were some questions about how we actually practice an ethics of care in terms of our work. And part of that is taking the time to actually not just continue moving forward and using languages that can in many ways be exclusionary, but actually building trust, building knowledge from the ground, ensuring that community members themselves are able to lead the way in terms of saying what's happening within their neighborhood and how to be able to make that change themselves. And so that's something that we also see as very, very critical in terms of this work as well. And I just wanted to acknowledge that. I noticed we have maybe 1 more minute left, and I noticed there was a question as well about how to be able to get in contact with everyone. So maybe I'll really quickly pass it to Alejandra and then back to Hannah to close us out for the session.
Okay, sorry about that. We'll have to hear Kumsa's story at another time. The Power Lab is powerlab.ca. I'd be happy to try to get people with the right information if they're looking at generating a campaign. Thank you for the mention around dealing with racism. Like, an anti-racist orientation has been critical to, and it's foundational when we talk about equity. And definitely the comment that was made around remote and rural communities or smaller communities, it's that extractive approach, whether it's a resource company or a tech developer, it's the same approach. And so we've learned a lot from impact agreements that First Nations have signed. That was one of the first kind of things that we looked at when we were trying to look about how to structure a community benefits agreement. So many comments coming in fast and furious, but I just want to give Hannah a chance to close this out and just to share one last thank you and one last slide with you. Just to recap what we've been talking about. It's just that this idea that what we're trying to disrupt is that the economy is this thing out there that doesn't belong to us. It's all of us. And that whether we live in a rural community or whether we're a person living in an inner suburb of the city, that we have power and that it's a relationship, that it can be built when we organize. I mentioned start with values, and that's how we're going to generate the most strategic demands. The partnerships across sectors are critical. Without the full community participation and changing demands, we won't have a base of people to come and claim them, to mobilize in their favor, and to make sure that decision makers are held accountable to commitments that are made. You've heard a lot around ambitioning small things, building trust and relationship, and then going on to bigger things. But ultimately, what we want is policy change. We don't want to have to fight things one at a time. That's why the inclusionary zoning organizing is so important. And what we're building to last is the leadership and the capacity for people who are historically disadvantaged to act in their own interest for themselves. So thank you so much for your participation, and to our amazing partners, Kumsa Bakker and Judy Duncan and Anna Teresa Porti, who participated in the chat.
Thank you so much to all of you. What an inspiring and rich conversation, and it seems like there's so much energy still pouring in the chat box. We really appreciate you all taking the time to reflect and share with us today, and for everyone who was able to join in the call. This was an incredible webinar. The recording is going to be posted on the CCEDNet website in the coming days, and we'll send you the link as soon as it's available, along with resources that we've been collecting in the chat box. And you should also receive an email with a link to a 1-minute evaluation survey. And if you could take a second and just fill that out right away, that would be wonderful. Your feedback is really important to us. If you'd like to stay in touch and engage in other topics related to today's discussion, please check out the websites of the Canadian CED Network and all of the organizations that were on the webinar today. We can follow up with links to all of them as well. And feel free to sign up to CCEDNet's free email newsletters. Thank you to everyone for sticking around till 1 o'clock. Enjoy your lunch or your morning, wherever you're calling in from, and we hope to see you again. Thank you, Mercedes, Alejandra, Kumsa, Judy. Thanks everyone for being here.